Call it in! Everyone okay?
This is Sigma 5. We have a down state.
All right, by the book. Locate the survivors, evacuate the wounded, secure the site.
Yes, sir!
Check your weapons. Check. Two, that way. Three, that way. Follow me.
Yes, sir. Jenny, take Sue to the ground floor. We're moving.
Yes, sir!
There we go. Bring it down. Bring it down.
With me, let's go.
The medics, there's more medics coming!
Hello Alien fans, fellow Mudbeards, and anyone who thinks this show is really good at leaving you screaming at the TV. You can just see all the powder they're pouring in this keg for when it's inevitably going to burst. And I wanted to take the time in this video to sort of break down the beginnings of these characters and where their potential arcs will be going, as well as highlight why Kirsch is one of, if not the best character within the series so far. But to start, we'll very briefly recap episodes 3 and 4, and to summarize, essentially they returned from the attack in Prodigy City and began establishing some of the character arcs and connections with each other, which I'll kind of get into throughout the character breakdown portion of the video. But we do get to spend a lot of time of my personal favorite segment of the last 2 episodes, and that's experimentation with the aliens. And while I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the idea of Wendy being able to speak xenomorph, I do like the narrative potential of someone with a human-ish mind being able to control xenomorphs, because that could become a very serious problem and is the closest the franchise has gotten to potentially weaponizing the species. We also get a very cool sequence with the eyeball squid, otherwise known as the T. ocellatus, and we get a very disgusting scenario that I wanted to actually look away from, of the sheep getting taken over and being used as sort of a host. And all of this is just build up to when we finally see what happens when this thing gets a hold of an actual human host. And I think Boy Cavalier has definitely put himself up there on the Oculus menu. Part of me wonders if this alien creature does have a primary consciousness, but carries some of the memories and or knowledge of previous species it's inhabited. We see that when it takes over a host, it can move just like the host intends to, with the cat in the earlier episodes, and not so much with the sheep when it decided to go bipedal. That being said, I think I saw a glimpse of something in the trailer where one of the crew of the Maginaut got infected. Or maybe I was just misinterpreting it. Either way, I'm very excited to see what could happen. Okay, that will go ahead and conclude the brief recap. Let's go ahead and get into some of the character breakdowns. Let's go ahead and start with the Sylvia couple. See, Arthur and Dame Sylvia are actually the researchers for Prodigy, but they seem to be balancing on the moral alignment scale. Arthur seems to essentially be the voice of reason when it comes to mostly everybody on the island, immediately rejecting the idea of bringing these aliens back to base, and continuously disagreeing with almost every decision every person is making around him. And it really makes you feel bad for the dude, because odds are he's not making it off this island alive. But that leads me to Dame. Dame seems to be a very nurturing mother figure for a lot of the LBs, or Lost Boys as I refer to them. But no matter how nurturing she seems to be, she also seems to be a scientist first and foremost, keeping the procedures and protocols locked in place for whenever something goes awry. So I could see her reaching a point where she sides more for the science rather than safety. And it's obvious her husband doesn't really see the LBs as anything more than a real project. And while he hopes maybe the kids are still in there, he very much makes it clear that he doesn't believe they're anything more than machines. But let's go ahead and break down some of these machines. We have Smee, who seems to be a bit of a goofball, but very laid back in general. And of all the LBs, while he is a bit immature, he's definitely one of the more tolerable ones. And when I say tolerable, I'm not saying that coming from a place of hate, as a lot of characters need time to grow and develop, but that doesn't mean their introductions and their struggle period are any much more pleasant to watch or sit through. And that leads me to a better example being Slightly. Slightly, while the acting and performance is completely fine, is definitely a bit intolerable at this point in the series. I can tolerate him acting like an immature kid. I can even tolerate him getting manipulated by Morrow and potentially getting tricked into causing an outbreak on the island. But I think in his interactions with Hermit this episode, I finally just kinda got pushed past my limits. He's obviously upset that Wendy's brother gets to be on the island, and it kinda makes sense, he's a kid, and considering what's happening with his own family, I kinda get where he's coming from. Still, Hermit very quickly made it clear that he kind of agrees with everything Slightly is saying, and thinks all of them should have all their families here, and potentially could be an ally to some of these people that Slightly has no power or control over. And yes, I get it, he's a kid, he's not gonna put all this together and probably make some dumb decisions. But there's only so many dumb decisions that you can really tolerate of a character. Something tells me though, some of this establishment for him being this way and a little bit irritable and hard to digest is specifically because he's due for some serious karma and a come around. Specifically referencing his discussion about his deceased family member when they contemplated the idea of him still being alive. And with Slightly being a synthetic or an LB, I really do think that he could get caught in a similar situation, especially if the whole island goes up in flames. And if that is the case, I could see my opinions for the character definitely switching. But let's go into Toodles. Toodles is actually a really enjoyable character for the LBs, as he seems to mind his own business, wants some of the same aspirations some of the other LBs want, but is primarily focused on becoming a scientist. Ever since he was first introduced, you could hear him speaking in the background about how smart he wanted to be, and how he hoped to learn everything. Something tells me if this series can go on for a few seasons and keep these characters around for a while, he could potentially grow to become one of the world's top scientists and one of the most necessary ones. Or he can be a star that burns bright and out way too early. But now let's get into Nibs. Nibs is a character who's obviously going to be a huge problem for most likely everyone there. She was one of the first people wanting to go home when it came to everybody arriving on the island. She also was one of the first of the LBs to get completely traumatized. It seems this trauma has left her mentally broken, unless there's a little bit more to do with this pregnancy she's speaking so much about. While she could just be combining different pieces of her traumatized mind, I do wonder if somewhere off screen there was someone who was able to infect her as a host. For any one of the species we've seen so far. We're still not quite sure what that hanging watermelon creature's supposed to do. I also wanted to quickly add that Lily Newmark, the actor for Nibs, commented on Nibs' trauma specifically. She stated she worked with some of the crew behind the scenes to develop sort of a pseudo backstory for Nibs. Meaning, while it wasn't necessarily written within the script, she and some of the other creators had come to the conclusion of sort of playing Nibs as a character who had been a victim of assault before the new sets of trauma she endures in Alien Earth. Essentially, the way the characters presenting themselves and coping with all these different sources of stress has sort of created this crucible that's boiling up in this pot that's about to explode. It leaves Nibs as a very interesting character and a good reflection on humanity's actions and how they affect the next generation. But that leads me to Curly. Curly is one of those characters who I personally am rooting for throughout this series. She's bordering the lines between potential problem and antagonist for the rest of the crew, and someone who maybe proves themselves to be a very valuable player, or potentially even sacrifices herself for some people around her, proving her allegiance is maybe standing in the right way of history. Or maybe she'll just get jealous of Wendy and try to kill her. Either way, she seems to have her own ambitions, and those ambitions are being utilized by the Boy Cavalier in order to actually pit her and Wendy against each other, primarily just putting Curly down for not being as good as Wendy. Which leads me to Boy Cavalier's character. He is someone who acts like he's the father of all the LBs, but is very much presenting himself as Peter Pan. Who anyone who's seen the Peter Pan stories and maybe thought about them a little bit deeper will realize Peter Pan is a pretty messed up character. Because Peter Pan taking kids from their homes and having them become immortal because he doesn't want to be alone, as well as his hatred for grown-ups and any rules. I don't know, there's just a lot of similarities between that and Boy K. But that's not to say Boy K is just an alien version of Peter Pan, because he's definitely bringing a sort of uniqueness to the idea of being a CEO in this world. The few glimpses we've gotten of the Big Five, that being Prodigy, Weyland-Yutani, Dynamic, Threshold, and Lynch. Let me know if I got any of those wrong. Essentially, a lot of these people carry themselves how you see a lot of CEOs in most series and movies. They got the suits, they got the etiquette, they got the political nature they seem to carry about themselves. But Boy Cavalier seems like someone who's a little bit of a new generation CEO. Someone who sort of stands out amongst the rest simply because he's focused on his own journey. He wants to develop his own research, his own experiments, and his own potential equal, as he really sees himself as the best around and just wishes he could get into a conversation with someone smarter than him. Which again touches on the whole Curly-Wendy dynamic he has going on. Curly is someone who's already studied multiple languages and does carry herself with a lot of ambition, versus Wendy very much still acts like a kid in a lot of her mannerisms and her dialogue. But that does lead me to wonder why Wendy is capable of doing so many more things than the rest of the LBs, and why Boy K would even keep that a secret if he knew one of them had a huge advantage over the other. Maybe this sort of reveal could be why Curly eventually teams up with Wendy, seeing that the only reason she's not favorited is because maybe a different chip or implant was put into Wendy compared to the rest. But still, I really like Boy Cavalier as a character. He's not necessarily as malicious as someone like Joffrey, but he is very tunnel visioned and unempathetic, both very common traits for CEOs of large corporations. And I think his fate is going to be tied directly to the T. Ocelus. I wondered if a facehugger would eventually find him, as it's kind of been hinted at a few times, but with the sequence with the T. Ocelus in episode 4, I think that was definitely foreshadowing. But let's go back to Wendy for a second. Wendy is a character who's been pretty interesting to watch so far, but is the one LB I've seen who I can't really tell sometimes if she's actually a synthetic or a human, which could actually coincide with the idea that she got more programming than everybody else. But there are moments where she definitely acts like a child, and moments where she moves and carries herself like a robot or a synthetic. I really was hoping to see her take on a more leadership role for the LBs throughout the season, but that was more when I thought the season would be about a full-on alien outbreak and everybody just trying to survive, and not so much about research and the potential of an outbreak. And again, just not a huge fan of the idea of her speaking xenomorph. That's not to say it wasn't illustrated well or delivered in a very unique and cool way, but the concept itself on paper just comes off a little cartoony. I'm hoping maybe there will be a twist on this aspect later on that we don't actually see coming, but the idea of a human leading a bunch of xenomorphs with their mind or just through speech is a cool one, but has to be tackled in a very careful way, I feel. And setting-wise, I feel really only makes sense aesthetically in a sort of wasteland era environment, as the imagery of a person donned in a cloak walking through some rubble with a bunch of xenomorphs crawling around them is a lot easier to digest with a wasteland surrounding them versus someone in a jumpsuit walking through a neighborhood with xenomorphs following them, which would just come off a little bit goofy. But that's just my personal opinion, who knows. Let's go ahead and get into her brother. Her brother is a very interesting character. He seemed very kind, very straightforward, but the xenomorphs were strangely obsessed with him throughout the entire few episodes we saw them. There's definitely more to his backstory, like whatever happened with him and Rashidi and Siberian on the other side of the world, and I do think there's more to why he wasn't able to show up and see Wendy at the hospital that he's maybe just not trying to say, and maybe could explain why he's so desperate to reconnect with her, maybe to make up for lost time. But I do hope there's some form of an explanation for why that xenomorph was so interested in him and didn't rip him apart as quickly as everyone else. Maybe there will be a similar connection to why the xenomorphs are so interested in Wendy and somehow speaking through her, but I did enjoy the fact that Hermit got his lung replaced and the same lung birthed a brand new xenomorph. Which does leave you to wonder, I think this xenomorph and Hermit, as well as Wendy obviously, will all have a connection now, as xenomorphs always act a little strangely around hosts. Could this mean that Hermit is seen as a host and not a threat anymore? Let's go ahead and move on to the character of Morrow. Morrow, performance-wise, is absolutely killing it this season, and he's one of the few characters whose backstory I'm really excited to see. That's not to say there's not been enough that's been hinted at so far to tell us where he's actually coming from. Again, he got sent out on the Maginot and returned with everybody he knew and loved gone. We also know that he had a daughter. And while it hasn't been visually displayed on screen, it seems he chose to sacrifice his life in researching for all these species. And now, with people taking away his life's research, it leaves him wondering if any of it was really even worth it. Essentially, he sacrificed a relationship with his family, and they took the thing he sacrificed that for. But that brings me to my absolute favorite character so far, that being Kirsch. See, androids are always a fan favorite in the Alien franchise, at least until Prometheus came around. And Romulus kind of freshened up the idea again, but androids are usually a debate in every installment on whether or not they will actually turn against us. Kirsch very much balances the line between being another Ash or another David, but there is also potential he could turn out to be a Bishop or an Andy. Andy being from Alien Romulus for anyone who hadn't seen it. There's moments where he seems to put humans or even the LBs down, or their human nature, But when push comes to shove, he does shove Boy Cavalier out of the room and make sure everyone approaches things cautiously and safely. That being said, something that makes it hard to really pinpoint where his ambitions actually lie is how he is treated a little bit horribly by the humans around him, as in he is kind of just treated as a tool. But also, Timothy Oliphant's performance really does capture this very awkward, mysterious vibe. And I'm not just talking about the faces he makes that looks like he smells something really bad and is assuming it's someone else in the room with him, but more specifically in the way he talks. There's a sense of soft threatening that he carries to himself. But why does Kirsch act just a little bit more quirky than another android like the David model we saw in Alien Prometheus? I personally believe that Boy Cavalier has already hinted as to why. See, Kirsch is a synthetic who was also implemented with some of the world's top philosophers and their writings. And this potentially makes him a 50-50 for being a powder keg that takes everything down around him. See, not being human, but studying human philosophy could make him really see how insignificant and damaging human beings are. And should his ambitions or priorities not rely on humanity and its safety and fortitude, then with all the things he necessarily researched, I couldn't see him as a synthetic coming to any other conclusion than humanity's kind of a problem, or more specifically, their lack of control. But this could also lead him to heavily sympathize with humanity and their struggles. He can watch as an observer as different humans try to struggle with concepts that are unavoidable, like Wendy and the idea that Hermit one day will die, or the Boy K and his complete disregard of his own safety as well as his staff, in the hopes of researching this shiny new toy he's picked up. I mean, there is even a chance he could see what's happening with Wendy by the end of episode 4 and maybe try to find a way to utilize and weaponize xenomorphs altogether. But I think none of that could be done without Oliphant's performance, because my gosh, what a quirky character. Either way, what do you guys think about the series so far? I am enjoying its quality as a television show by itself, but I will say I am kind of wishing it was more leaning towards the xenomorph horror side. And I know series can take a while to really do a grand build-up, but in regards to the people we have introduced on Prodigy Island, they're more interesting as characters to be developed rather than characters to be killed off in a slasher-like style. And by that I mean I'm not necessarily rooting for any of them to make it off the island safely. The humans aren't necessarily trustworthy, the synthetics are synthetics. I wish there was one human, and maybe that's supposed to be Hermit, that you could just be like, I really hope this person makes it off the island. But Hermit is also someone heavily tied to the main plot. I guess essentially what I'm trying to say is the show has no Ripley. Ripley was a character people discarded. Ripley was a character people put down. Ripley was a character people pushed aside and eventually proved herself when she came out on top. That being said, there is one character who could be fitting this potential role, that being Curly. And sure, you might be thinking, wouldn't Wendy fit this role a little better? I would actually argue she's a little bit too central to the plot and has just a little bit too much spotlight on her. I would actually prefer if she became an antagonist and used xenomorphs to hurt a lot of people around her, maybe even humanity as a whole. But Curly is someone who already established she wants to help the world. And yeah, she's a kid, she may be a little jealous of her sister Wendy and all the special treatment she's getting, but she's still not shown to be as malicious or malevolent as someone like Slightly or someone like Morrow or Boy K. I'm really hoping by the end of the season, Curly will be the most human character out of all the characters we've seen so far. But again, we'll just have to wait and see. Either way, thank you all for watching. Be sure to tune into my Alien Isolation live streams during the weekends as I kind of try to beat the game until the series is finished. I'm horrible when it comes to jump scares, so it's kind of a fun time. But please, let me know who your favorite character is. Either way, appreciate the support, appreciate the feedback. And remember, that island is a powder keg that everyone just keeps filling up, so when it blows, it's gonna be bad.